I think it's already doing it.
I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Profit webinar, General Food Safety Liability and Introduction to Legal Issues in Marketing. This webinar is part of our Profit Risk Management series that includes 8 webinars and 8 in-person workshops focused on a variety of topics, including food safety, regulations, GAP certification, crop insurance, and risk management tools. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you will see a flyer that contains all of the information you will need to join any of the trainings in this series. You'll also find a slideshow being presented today that you can download and keep for later reference. Once the presentation is done, I'll unmute all attendees and we'll have about a 30-minute Q&A. After the webinar is complete, the webinar software will prompt you to fill out an evaluation for this webinar. If you could take a moment to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. This series is possible with the support from the USDA Risk Management Agency, the University of Arkansas School of Law Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative, who have joined with the Farm Credit Council and Morse Marketing to offer this important series of workshops. I'd like to introduce Janie Hipp, Director of the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative, who will be today's presenter. Janie Sims Hipp is a Chickasaw Nation citizen and the founder-director of the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative. She has been a licensed attorney in Oklahoma for more than 30 years and specializes in food and agricultural law and Indian law. Prior to launching the initiative, she served in the Obama administration as the senior advisor for tribal relations to Secretary Tom Vilsack, and prior to her appointment with the Office of the Secretary, she served in the National Institute of Food and Agriculture at the USDA as a national program leader for farm financial management education, trade adjustment assistance, and the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. She also served as the USDA Risk Management Agency as the Risk Management Education Director. Please welcome Janie.
Thanks, Emerald. Can everybody hear me okay, Emerald? Am I coming through loud and clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. And one of our other partners that we would be derelict if we didn't mention is Intertribal Ag Council. They've also partnered with us on this entire series, and many of the in-person events that are coming up, one later this week, you'll have Intertribal Ag Council folks there as well. So let's just launch into this. If it's okay with everyone on the phone, I'd like to just kind of march through these slides and get them kind of out of the way so that we can really then open up for questions and answers and dialogue afterwards. We've done it both ways, having the line open all the time. Sometimes, you know, noisy things happen in your office and you have no control over it. So this seems to be kind of a better way to do it. So if you'll just bear with us, or bear with me for a little bit, I'm going to walk you through some general food safety liability and introduction to legal issues in marketing. But before I do that, I wanted to remind everybody that each one of our webinars, as well as all of the content that we are doing in person, will all be reachable either on our website. Obviously, it'll all be there, but we've archived it. It'll be a part of the recording of this webinar, and if you have any issues at all finding it or downloading it and using it for your personal use, just let us know. And I think there's a contact slide at the very end, or you could just Google us and we pop right up, and we're happy to send you anything you need. Last webinar I did, we talked a little bit more in depth about the new FSMA law, the Food Safety Modernization Act law, and we got a little bit into GAP certification on that one as well. I'll tell you right now that the area of food safety liability and analyzing your risk and market access and getting into markets can't really be done in one webinar. It is literally the level of issues that kind of surround these legal areas are sufficiently complicated that you're gonna need to just keep coming back developing your own, kind of library of resources, we're happy to function in that regard with you. And if you run across any issues that you just cannot untangle, you can't figure out, then just pick up the phone and call us. We'll do our do so. Emerald? Are we having trouble advancing? There it goes. All right, so, just a little short slide here. Some of this data, those of you on the phone already know. Indian country is very deeply involved in food. According to the last Ag Census, which was done a couple of years back, we have, every time the census is done, it looks like we have about $3 billion annual income across Indian country. It's not exactly half and half, but it tends to be pretty close to half of that being livestock related, all kinds of livestock, and the other half being all other crops. The business of food and agriculture in Indian country is done in a variety of ways. It's done through tribal governments, as literally a tribal farm. It's done through business arms or business ventures that the tribe launches. Could be very, third-party, very arm's-length transactions. It's also done through individual tribal producers, and nonprofits and community-based organizations get into it as well. I'm not sure exactly what happened there. I think I'm having some connection issues right now. Sorry. Bear with us.
Yeah, you are cutting in and out a little bit, Janie, but just go ahead.
No, I lost the slide deck altogether.
Okay, do that again.
And I'm not sure whether it's just me. Yeah, there we go. All right, so if you could go to the next slide. I think it's back. Please, if anybody is on this and you're not seeing the screen properly, just drop me an email, jhipp, Hipp at UARC, and we'll fix you right up. Or enter something into the chat room. So regardless of how you're doing food, food safety is an issue. It's really not enough to grow and harvest our food. We literally do have to pay attention to the safety of that particular food. Last webinar we did, we went into a lot of detail around hazards that are related to foods. Biological hazards, bacteria, molds, naturally occurring toxins in food, chemical hazards, physical hazards, and then when we talk about food safety, we also talk about microorganisms that can be present in food under the right conditions, or if you see that on the flip side, the wrong conditions. It's very important, I think, for folks who are going to be moving food around, growing food, feeding your people, as well as particularly if you're going to go into the commercial marketplace at all. And that is even at a farmer's market or a farm to school or anything of that nature. You kind of owe it to yourself to not just take my word for it, that there are microorganisms that can create food safety problems. Next time you're near a land-grant institution, go in and see if you can actually take a look in the microbiological labs and literally see the microorganisms that are usually too small to be seen by the naked eye that can wreak havoc in food safety liability. And that's why, these things are just really so important and why we can't say enough about them. Next slide. So I know sometimes it's easier to talk about these issues if you tell a story. And so if you'll bear with me just a moment, and if you'll also bear with me, today I'm next door to the Native American Rights Fund at their headquarters. in Boulder, and so I've set up office here right next door to him at the law library, and so I'm very excited to be here. But if you hear any background noise, that's it. I'm not at home in my office, so just kind of hang with us. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's not a pleasant story, but it does help, I think, to actually walk through some of these food safety liability issues if you can think about it in terms of a story. And it really helps, I think, producers that I've worked with over the years to really kind of put their head around what exactly they might be facing and how to prevent problems. Nobody likes to talk about the worst case scenario, including me, but I would not be doing my job if I wasn't walking you through a worst case scenario and literally helping you do problem solving around how to prevent a catastrophic problem from happening. So in this particular fact situation, we have 50 producers. They're working with the tribe on food and agriculture within the jurisdiction of the tribe that is called food. So you're the food tribe. You have a company. It almost kind of functions like a food hub. If any of you are familiar with food hubs, literally aggregation sites for raw product. That food company sits on the border of the tribe of food and the state of Thrones. So you can tell what my husband and I did on Sunday night, which is watch Game of Thrones. So half of the producers are in the state, half of them are in the tribe, in the tribal jurisdiction. All of them have been in business together loosely for about 5 years. They're turning a profit for the individual producers and for the food company of the tribe. The bottom line, the financial condition of all involved is increasing over time, and everybody's very excited and happy about that. The sustainability of the food business itself is becoming very solid, and it's also leading to improved economic situations in the tribe, as well as heightened and better access to fresh food that's local. When I tell you they did not incorporate, what I'm talking about is they didn't incorporate as a business. They didn't become a C Corp or a small business or a partnership officially. They just are a loose coordination of producers who are loosely connected with the company that they work with.
There?
Okay, so yeah, there it is. So I'm asking you to imagine some more. There's a major Listeria outbreak in the state of Thrones and in the tribe of food. 5 dead, 50 hospitalized, 10 in the ICU for a month, and the product is traced to 2 of the 50 farms in the food region. One of the farms is in the state jurisdiction and one is in the tribal jurisdiction. One of them has been bought out by a corporate investor. One of them is still within the family, but it's been bought out by the family of the owner, of the original owner. The investor owner is doing some elaborate, mechanization to shield that business from liability. And the family-owned farm hasn't incorporated yet under the new owners, and the previous owners weren't incorporated either. All of those I'll be talking about in just a few minutes. The food was labeled and marketed as natural, non-GMO, but it was also marketed as healthier for you and the best for you and your baby. Next slide. All right, when I said Listeria, Listeria is a bacteria. It is can be found in uncooked meats and vegetables. It can be found in a variety of foods. Human infections follow the consumption of food that's contaminated with Listeria. It can be present in a lot of different kinds of foods. And if you talk to food scientists, they will tell you that when Listeria gets into a food business, a food factory. In fact, I use the word factory, but that can be, a very small building or a very large building. It really doesn't matter. But when it gets into the food business itself or the food handling location, it can live there for years. It is killed by cooking and pasteurization, and it can also grow and multiply in some foods in the refrigerator. If you were on the webinar last time we did a webinar, a couple of weeks ago, I actually had some slides in that one that talked about the temperatures at which some of these bacteria and microscopic foodborne illnesses can thrive. And so paying attention to how you handle and how you, just how you store, how you refrigerate or not, any kind of foods that are meant for human consumption, it's really, really important particularly if you're going into the commercial marketplace. I'm of the opinion that you need to pay attention to that regardless of whether you're just feeding your extended family. It's very important to make sure that you handle food properly so that you don't inadvertently set some of these bacteria in motion. Next slide. The case fatality rate for Listeria outbreaks can be up to 20%. Clinical manifestations are sepsis and meningitis complicated by encephalitis. So any of you who are, remotely medically inclined, those are not pretty illnesses to have. Animals can be carriers of Listeria. It can be found in fruits. Pasteurization and sufficient cooking can kill it, but literally the best way to deal with it is to avoid it altogether and do everything you can as a producer, as a food business, as a food handler to control for allowing this even to come into your food supply. Next slide. So, this slide talks a little bit more about the facts. We're in kind of a state of change right now. Food safety liability has been around for eons. It's been around for years and years and years and years and years. The Food Safety Modernization Act has only been around for less than 10 years, and we only have new regulations around that act, implementing that act since last September. And so a lot of farms and food businesses are making decisions right now about how they're going to come into compliance with that act, how they're going to try to absorb these new requirements into their operation, into their farming and ranching operation, as well as their food business. A lot of folks kind of around the whole food sector are moving as quickly as they can towards GAP, Good Agricultural Practices certification. A lot of them, if they haven't already, are doing HACCP plans. But this one gives you a little bit of facts that it's a mixed bag with regard to the farms that are involved in this facts situation about who has a GAP plan and who doesn't, who has a HACCP plan and who doesn't, and so who's been certified, who hasn't. It can be a real mix. You also will see that in my fact situation, some of the farms carry insurance, like general liability insurance, but some do not. And the last webinar we had, we talked about FLIP insurance, which is a form of food liability insurance that's available to anybody in the food sector. And it's really designed more towards smaller end producers. And if you just Google FLIP insurance, F-L-I-P insurance, then it'll pull right up and it'll show you what's involved in those insurance contracts and what it covers and what it doesn't. And it's very economical to have. And we encourage, if you don't do FLIP, then at least go find some sort of insurance, particularly if you're in a commercial marketplace. Next slide. So I hate to tell you, but baby Jay got sick with Listeria, went into the hospital, went into ICU, and ultimately passed. And you're saying to yourself, why is she talking this badly? This happens. This happens more often than you think. And so when you hear about foodborne illness outbreaks, and you hear about CDC coming on TV, you know, to everyone who has bought this, that, or the other, and it has these codes on it, throw it away. They're really serious about it, because anytime you have a foodborne illness outbreak that is traceable to a source, it's really important to actually get that food supply that's that particular source of the problem out of the consumption stream. And so, you know, if you look over time at food law and food safety law and litigation in the courts around food, very often you'll find an illness occurs through some foodborne bacteria like Listeria. There are others. In my previous webinar, we talked about the variety of other illnesses that are possible. But, you know, what happens is usually people become very ill, and some folks pass. And so when that happens, there's a whole triggering mechanism for what happens next. And, you know, I'm not trying to make people scared, but what I am trying to give you a glimpse of is what then happens when these things, you know, hit, you know, a foodborne illness outbreak level, that it impacts people. They have to go to the hospital, or they, you know, have lifelong struggles with their health as a result of food, or they pass. So what happens next if baby J passes away is that mom is going to go find a law firm, and that happens in real life. The lawyers for that baby are going to file a lawsuit against the food company, and they're going to try to find out exactly which farms were affiliated with that food company. On the administrative side of the house, so what I would just outline to you is what can happen in the court system. On the administrative side of the house, whenever things are triggered and a foodborne illness shows up in a hospital, there's an entire reporting mechanism that kicks in, and it literally goes all the way from local, county, and state level reporting, and it can also go up into the CDC and other health-related federal agencies that illnesses, and those are separate and apart, very much related to, but separate and apart from what can happen in the court system. So my fact situation today is really talking about the court system, but you know, the reality is that when these illnesses and outbreaks happen, the administrative agency side of the house can actually trigger, the company itself can actually do a voluntary recall. But if that doesn't happen, the agencies for sure can force that recall to happen. I have a slide a little bit further on that really, and I mentioned it during our last webinar, that we literally do live in a CSI world. Many of you may watch TV and are enthralled by the various CSI, you know, kind of series that we have on TV. They sort of intrigue me because I really don't understand a lot of that very much. But we live in that kind of world. And so when someone presents at a hospital door with an illness that's related to food, there's a whole investigatory cascade of events, and we can literally trace that food from your stomach back to the farm that it came from. So you're literally in a scenario where a chain of evidence is going to be put together over time. Sometimes it's hard to do. Sometimes the administrative agencies just can't get it done. They can't connect the dots. But sometimes it's clear. And so, you know, these are scenarios that can and do happen every day. If you don't trust me and if you don't believe what I'm saying, then go to fda.gov and actually sign up to get their foodborne illness outbreak press releases. And I get those, and I'm sure there's a lot of people on this phone call who get them. But what you will see is that every single day you're going to get some sort of recall, voluntary or required recall, or some undeclared allergen, or some foodborne illness that has happened with a particular food in a particular place. And so if you're in the food business, if you're going to be in that commercial marketplace, you really owe it to yourself to keep up. And so what I share with a lot of people is to just go ahead and sign up for those things and see what is emerging, see how the agencies deal with it, and see where some of these foodborne illnesses are coming from. It'll really open your eyes. Next slide. So in the course of the litigation, a lot of things will happen, a lot of investigation and a lot of discovery, but at some point the lawyer were involved. What was there a corporate structure for the food company and the individual farms? Where are the records of the production? Who keeps those records? Are there any records? Were there any agreements between the parties? Remember in my fact situation a couple of slides back, I talked about how there was just a loose coordination. Everybody just kind of showed up at the food company and showed up with their raw products. You know, are there any written agreements between the parties that allocate who has liability in case of a foodborne illness outbreak? Who is in control of the company's day-to-day operation? Does it have a board of advisors? Does it have a board, period? And what has the food companies and the farms done to comply with what are the food safety, marketing, and labeling requirements for that particular food? You know, the moral of the story, and I hate to tell you this, is that the lawyer for Baby Jay's mom is looking for a deep pocket. When you lose a child or your parent to a foodborne illness outbreak, it can be an excruciating death, and those folks who do that are not going to rest until they find some way to compensate their families. And so that's sort of the scenario you're walking into. This is not new. There are lawsuits that have been a part of our court system in the U.S. for decades and decades and decades and decades around food safety issues. And just because you have GAP certification and a HACCP plan doesn't mean that you have, you know, basically gotten a free ride on foodborne illness outbreaks or food safety liability. It is a part of the puzzle that you have to deal with as an operator or as a food producer or a food company, but we'll go on and continue talking about that. Next slide. I'm going to start moving through some of these next slides. They're available to you. You can ponder them and study them to your heart's content. The administrative responses can be what I've talked about earlier. The administrative agencies are going to look at investigations, publicity, warnings to the public, civil penalties, administrative fines. The federal agencies are now moving into criminal prosecution, and that's a big flag that you need to be thinking about. Used to, that did not happen at all. Obviously, it can involve civil lawsuits, which we're talking about right now, but the bottom line is that there's going to be a lot of folks looking to try to figure out the chain of evidence and the chain of, that occurred within the food supply chain, and shut that down in such a way that it takes bad food off the market, but also shut it down in a way that they can clean it up. So even if you have GAP certification or an audit or HACCP plan, you're still going to have to be very vigilant and make sure that if your farm is one of those ones, or food company is one of those ones that gets kind of pulled into an investigation because maybe there's 3 or 4 different sources for that avocado. I don't know. I mean, just make it up. But at the end of the day, if you get implied in that kind of regionality of where this food might have come from, the best thing you can have to help yourself is good records, certifications, insurance policies. I mean, just, get yourself into this frame of mind that the last thing you want to do is put everything on the line. Your operation, your tribe's operation, your food company, your home. I mean, there's just layers of things that you should think about. It is possible to manage for all of this, though. We wouldn't have any food companies alive today if this was impossible to manage for. So keep that in mind. And it's literally a lot of homework and a lot of day-to-day record keeping and a lot of vigilance. But it's not impossible. It happens every single day that people have very good lives being in the food system. So I just want you to keep that in mind, but I also want to make sure that you don't walk into these things that you do with your life, grow our food, harvest our food, have a food company with blinders on. That's not going to be doing you any good or me any good. I also think it's very important that if you're ever implied in a problem, that your lawyer, if you have to go to one, has something to work with, has something to point to say, didn't come from him, didn't come from her. So those kinds of, preparations and preventive controls are extremely important. Next slide. These next few slides I'm going to go through kind of quickly. A lot of people, say, well, what kind of business do I need to be actually in a food hub or a food company or a farm or a ranch? A lot of people can be sole proprietors. I don't usually advise people to do that because I think that there are some advantages to having a business that is incorporated or that has some kind of ongoing requirements to keep it open as a valid business. Any country has choices that involve a lot of other options that extend beyond just state law options. But you really, I think, owe it to yourself if you're walking into this food world. And particularly if you're going into the commercial marketplace, I think you owe it to yourself to at least ask and answer the question. Back in the 80s when I started doing this work, a lot of people were sole proprietors. But as a sole proprietor, there's really no corporate boundary between you and all of your assets and the world at large. And you really need to, if you're going to be a sole proprietor, you need to do it from an informed place. So consider these other options. See if there's a reason why you might want to choose one of them, and then make the choice. A lot of people go with S-Corps. A lot of people nowadays love LLCs, limited liability corporations. But there are record-keeping requirements attached to all of them, including cooperatives, including partnerships. And I think the discipline associated with actually keeping these corporate structures alive and functioning and still in good standing every year really would serve most producers and food companies well, and it would at least give you another measure of protection. But even the corporations that we've listed there are not going to give you 100% ironclad protection against liability. And that's just the way it is, because most corporate infrastructures are really designed to deal with tax issues or ways to build your business so that it is stronger financially, and really have, back in the day they used to have more protections in them, just kind of built into being a corporate structure, but the courts for years now have been what they call piercing the corporate veil, which literally reaches into the corporation and holds the principals of the corporation liable for any wrongdoings that might occur on their watch if they had a significant role in actually making the decisions that led to the problem. So just understand that there's a lot of, each one of these is different in various ways. If you want to, we could do a future webinar just explaining all of these business entities. But Emerald, if you'll just quickly let me kind of take folks through the next few slides and move past them. Next slide. So a business entity, I've already said, won't 100% protect you from liability. And some people have the idea that if they're incorporated, that they can't even be sued, and that's for sure not the case. So don't even consider that that is an ironclad protection for being in a lawsuit. Next slide. This slide talks about a little bit about sole proprietor, partnership, and corporation. And again, you need separate advice. You really need to be talking through a financial advisor or a lawyer in your area or somebody who can give you some advice locally about which is best for you. Next slide. This is just a few little tidbits of S-Corps, LLCs, cooperatives. We will be doing a webinar in the future around cooperatives. Those are an underutilized means of actually being a business entity in Indian country, and there's some very specific things that kind of attach to being a cooperative. So we're going to do a webinar series on that in the coming months. Nonprofit corporations, a lot of folks think they want to farm as a nonprofit entity. You can. But there's a whole other approval process that occurs at the IRS level for your nonprofit status, and taxation issues are unique to nonprofits as well. Next slide. There is a low-profit limited liability company. Those are fairly new. So again, it's just yet another option. And then in Indian country, you've also got Section 7 corporations. Tribal nonprofits under tribal law, and then tribal corporations under tribal law. Actually, I think that should be Section 17 corporations. Those are actually sanctioned by the Secretary of the Interior. Whole another process to get that approved. But again, make yourself at least consider what kind of business entity you want to be in your food business. It will serve you well to actually have gone through that process. Next slide. There's other considerations you need to think about too. Depending on where you're farming, you know, you may be off reservation, you may be off trust land. I don't know. There's so many variations of how people farm and ranch and do food in Indian country. It's not even funny. But you may be in a situation where you have to think about workers' comp and unemployment comp. Your taxation issues are going to be different depending on where you are doing this farming and food business. You always need to consider applying for permits and who's responsible for environmental health and safety issues. Then you've got this whole employment concern, who gets paid and how do they get paid? Do you have a board? Do you have an advisory board? Do you have a corporate structure that has board members? I mean, there's a lot to it. I mean, a lot of people who like to farm and ranch just like to go produce and put the seed in the ground and make it happen. And man, we love them. But you know, there are also all of these other pieces of the puzzle, particularly if you're selling outside your tribe. You really need to make yourself walk through these other considerations, because each one of them has a whole decision tree that sits around it about what you should and should not be thinking about in terms of making your business viable. Next slide. Let's just skip over this. So there's, you know, a whole range of food safety liability scenarios. In our fact situation, if you'll remember it again, will the food company protect the farmers from a lawsuit? Chances are no. What happens in these kinds of foodborne illness outbreaks is you can trace if you trace the food that was eaten back to a food company, that company, unless it's totally vertically integrated, got that food from somewhere, got the raw product from somewhere. So if you can think in your mind, the food company is one kind of player in this scenario, and then the various farms and ranches from which the food came from that went into the food company that turned it into something else. Those are different players as well. In a scenario like we talked about, it is entirely likely if the baby's mother's lawyer can track everyone down, it is likely that everyone in the picture could be sued. And that's why I said, will the farmers be sued? It's likely. The way the food safety laws have transpired over time is that because the science of foodborne illness and food science allows us literally to live in this CSI world, it is capable now to actually trace the component parts of those food items back to their original source. And so when your science can take you into that space, it's not long until the liability follows you into that space. And so if, in fact, all the farmers in this scenario are sued, it's really going to be up to each farmer to try to get themselves out of this crack they're in. And so that's when it really behooves you as an individual player to really keep impeccable records, be certified, have a HACCP plan. Just do everything that you can to try to be able to protect yourself if you ever fall into this circumstance. Next slide. And these kinds of cases last a long time. I'm just telling you. And they do involve a lot of money. And if you are carrying insurance, you at least have the potential for having some financial resources to help cover you and your legal fees should you ever get pulled into one of these. That's why, to me, those insurance policies are worth every penny. But the insurance policies themselves are contracts. And so it's very important that you read your contract so that you know exactly what you're paying for and exactly your responsibilities should you ever get pulled into one of these circumstances. So let's move on to the next slide. Food safety liability is strict liability under U.S. law. Food is considered a product under the Uniform Commercial Code, which covers all commercial transactions, or most commercial transactions in the U.S. Food is a good. It's not a service, it's a good. And goods have warranties that attach to them when they move through commerce. And so the manufacturer or the source of the food is liable for the harm it causes in the stream of commerce. And that's what liability and strict liability are all about. Strict liability is the most stringent level of liability possible because it really doesn't matter in a situation of strict liability what your intent was. You as a farmer would say, well, I didn't intend to hurt anybody. Under strict liability, it doesn't matter that you didn't intend it. What matters is that you put food into the stream of commerce and that it hurt someone. And that is all kind of wrapped up in this whole issue of strict liability and product liability under U.S. law. Next slide. Again, I've already mentioned a lot of the things that are covered in this slide, so we'll just slide right past it. Refer yourself back to our previous webinar slides. We go into gory detail, literally, about unsafe conditions, contamination issues, microbiological issues that can, cause problems to occur in food items. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is, your personal standards may not be your farmer neighbor or food company neighbor standards. So it's really, really important for you to be impeccable about how you grow food and put it into the marketplace. But it's also very important for you to know who you're in business with, right? And so if you're aggregating foods from a lot of different sources, you're literally relying on everybody else who's aggregating that food with you, that their standards are as impeccable as yours. And so it really behooves everyone who's involved in these emerging tribal food businesses to really think long and hard about how we're going to meet standards individually, but how we're going to help each other meet standards collectively. The Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission folks do a great job of this and have for many years now. They really focus on helping each other actually help all of their fishers to meet as high a level of food safety as they can in handling fish. And it's just very, very important. And anytime you have any, if Buck's on the line, just anytime you have any questions about, is this worth it, or what exactly is involved, I encourage you to pick up the phone and call us, but also don't take my word for it, call Buck. And sorry, Buck, if I'm deluging you with telephone calls, but it really does help to talk to people who've been through it, who know that there is value to actually kind of pulling together and lifting all boats in the food safety arena. Anyway, so let's go to the next slide. I think I've already touched on this strict liability issue, so let's go to the next slide. Sorry, I have a tendency to go out of order. Just hang with me. The other thing I want to talk about too, just briefly, and I've given you the slides on it, there's entire law classes that talk about these issues, but understand that when you put a good, which is food, into the stream of commerce, you're also doing so, and there's an entire area called warranties that sit around those goods. And some of those warranties, it's like I'm vouching for X. Some of those warranties are express, meaning they're written or they're said out loud, and then some of those warranties are implied by the court. And so as a matter of law, they are implied in the transaction that you're engaged in. Next slide. So express warranties. Again, I said, these can be either stated in writing or they can be verbally stated as a part of the sales transaction. Every so often I'll freak people out because I'll tell people that when you go down to the farmer's market and the farmer has a sign that has a dollar amount on it and says it's a tomato, the act of actually talking to that farmer and exchanging money for that food product is the exchange of value, and there are warranties that sit all around that transaction between those two parties, even though neither one of them signed a contract with each other. And so these things happen regardless of whether you've set in motion a written document to make it happen. But if you have any written documents that exchange between you as a food producer and the food company you're working with or your ultimate buyer of your food, if you have anything in writing, you've got to read it. You have to read your contract because it's extremely important what words are being said in those contracts. Express warranties can happen when the writings about the food product change hands between the parties. That's that example I just gave you on the farmer's market. But it can also happen just when people talk about the transaction itself. The farmer might actually say that that tomato has certain attributes or it meets a certain level of quality, and he or she may say, yeah, it has no acid in the tomato, or it has no seeds. I'm trying to get a little out there on this one, but the act of talking about that food actually can create a whole level of warranty that sits around that transaction that the buyer and the seller can literally be bound together and be required to perform what it is that they said they're going to do. Next slide. Implied warranties are implied by the court. So So even if they're not stated in writing or verbally, implied warranties can still exist, such as the product is guaranteed to work as it's claimed. It's conforming to the standards of food. It is fit for the purpose that it's normally used for. So if your tomato is meant to be food, it has to be fit to be food. And so that may seem kind of obvious, but that's the way the language of the law sits around these warranties. And in some cases, depending on what the food is, there are packaging and labeling requirements. And so you've got to be very specific when you get down into actually selling food, no matter who you're selling it to, that you really got to think about what you're saying about your food. And now we're starting to move in this webinar towards this whole marketing issue. It's got to be fit for the purpose. If it's not fit to eat, then what is the source of its unfitness? And then these warranties really require the business involved to take reasonable care to make sure that these fitness levels and safety levels and merchantability levels are met. Because regardless of whether you intend it to happen or not, these things sit around your transaction with regard to that food. Next slide. So I've given you a couple of examples, and the most recent example was literally last week of, and I'm always astounded when these things hit the media, but apparently there was a family in Europe, I can't even remember what country, but I'll get a visual and include it in these slides in the future, who literally poured out her Rice Krispies out of the box, and a small dead bat, intact, fully intact, was found in that box of cereal. So when you tell me these things can't happen, I will tell you that they happen still every day. There's all sorts of controls in big companies, in small companies, in tiny companies on your farm to try to keep these things from happening, but they happen. And nobody really, I don't think, intends for them to happen, although there is some corporate espionage that occasionally happens with regard to food. But at the end of the day, these, every so often you're going to have, you know, a little pebble, or you'll have, you know, the leg of something. I mean, some of this stuff is a little gory, and I'm sure I would not have wanted to dump out my Rice Krispies and see a fully intact bat in it, but it does occur. And so when that happens, it's pretty safe to say that somebody's going to be looking to the food company to reimburse or to compensate for that trauma. The whole article that I read was very focused on the trauma of the family who actually poured the Rice Krispies out into the cereal bowl. So it's just, it sets in motion some reactions by the consumer, but also some reactions by the marketplace, as well as reactions by the legal system. So bottom line, do everything you possibly can, you know, in your farming operation or in your food company to control for these sorts of eventualities. Next slide. Some warranties can be disclaimed. It has to be done very specifically. I'm going to just leave this slide for you to study later, but the Uniform Commercial Code that applies to transactions of commercial products in the U.S. really has some very specific language that is required in order to disclaim any implied warranties. And again, the UCC has slight differences from state to state, but it also, you need to also ask yourself, as a tribal food producer, does your tribe has it adopted the UCC? And if so, and has it adopted it wholesale? Has it tweaked it here and there? Has it not adopted it at all? Where is your food moving? Is it moving into 2 different jurisdictions that have 2 different versions of the UCC? There's a bit of homework that you have to do, whether you want to or not, if you're in the commercial marketplace. And I would suggest to you, too, that with regard to food safety liability, this kind of homework is necessary even if you donate food. There's different protections that come into play to protect people from being liable when they donate food. And some pieces of that are included in our Model Food Code project. But at the end of the day, if you're working in and around food, you really owe it to yourself to be knowledgeable about the state of the law of food, not just where you are, but where your food may be going just directly. And there are differences, state to state, tribe to tribe. Next slide. So there's also federal laws that regulate food that requires food to have certain standards. Food cannot contain harmful substances. It can't be unfit for human consumption. These are all matters of federal law. It can't be filthy, diseased, or contain weird substances in it that shouldn't be there for human food consumption. It can't be manufactured or produced in an unsanitary way, et cetera, et cetera. Again, you've got to look state and local law as well as tribal laws that may have very specific requirements in some of these areas. Next slide. So again, I get this all the time when I go out and talk to people. So what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to do the same thing that any reasonable business person would do. You got to manage your risk. You got to manage your exposure to risk. You got to examine all your practices and relationships. You've got to get and keep insurance and read your policies. And honestly, you've got to expect high levels of standards from everyone you're in business with, because their actions may imply your liability as well. There's no reason not to do a food business. The people who do food businesses love what they do. But the people who are successful at it are the ones who literally pay attention to these levels of details, because it's just necessary. And at the end of the day, it will help you to have a more stable business, a more sustainable business. And if you are interested in having income from the business, it will help your bottom line. Next slide. Again, transparency, clarity, know what the standards are, take steps to make sure that the standards are incorporated into your relationship, and keep up. Keep up, and don't be afraid to keep up. That's part of the reason why we launched the initiative, is to help Indian country's food people keep up. And we have yet even begun to launch everything that we intend to launch. These things take time, but we know what huge potential we all have in the area of food to stabilize our economies and feed our people better. And so this is just a part of it. We have to come to terms with a lot of these issues and just do what we can to make sure that we're as stable and secure as possible. Next slide. Again, this is just a really quick slide about making sure that you incorporate your standards, you know what they are, that if you're going to have written contracts, you've got to, really be careful about what you put in them, what each step in the chain of how your food moves from you to the consumer. I mean, those kinds of issues, sometimes it may seem like, well, all I really want to do is grow the food and serve it to people. That's great. You don't have to fall out of love with doing that. What you do need to do, though, is just make yourself take the time to actually walk through these issues that we're talking about. Next slide. Records. Again, I will tell you, as a lawyer, it's always better if my clients have some records that can help me prove that they have great standards, they follow their standards, they know what's going on, they've done their homework, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very hard to represent somebody who has no records. And I don't know how many times I have to say this, but it literally can mean the difference between staying in business and not. And so it's just easier to extract yourself from a situation if you have decent records to prove that you're not the problem. And so, but without those records, it's literally your word against somebody else's. So I'm just trying to, I always try to plead with everybody to have decent records. It will help your bottom line, but it'll also help you if you ever get pulled into these horrifying lawsuits. Next slide. I'm going to just, swing past this one as well. Again, training your employees. If you have employees, they have to be trained. You've got to do it regularly, not just yourself, but anybody who you might be coming up behind you to help you with your farm or to help you with your food business. A lot of people ignore that issue, and anytime you get somebody new, of course you've got to train them, but every so often us old folks need to actually have a refresher course. And so it's just really important that you set aside those times for those people who you pay to be a part of what you're doing, and make sure that they're properly trained. Next slide. Indian country can be different. It's obviously got different legal frameworks, and our jurisdictions are different, and we may require different responses. But I will tell you that some of these general principles of preventing problems, making sure you have solid relationships in the food chain, this idea of reasonableness and these duties that you have and responsibilities to not set in motion food safety problems, those are going to be the same no matter where you are. Next slide. And I will tell you, and that's why I put it in all bold, and yes, it's a little dramatic, but you've got to carry general and product liability insurance. That flip policy, go to the website, pull it down and take a look at it. And I will tell you also, if you have a production field in production, or if you have livestock and you have the ability to buy crop or livestock insurance for your food product, please take a look at it. It is worth the money to get it, because what it does is it insures against the market losses. It ensures your financial stability. The last thing you want to be looking at is having your home or your business tied up in some sort of lending relationship, and all of a sudden you have a devastating disaster and no crop insurance when you could have had it. So I think you just you've got to be thinking about these things. But anytime you're in the food business and you're selling to just general consumers out there, you've got to keep the insurance going with regard to your crops, but you also got to keep it going with regard to your business transaction. And you do have food safety liability, whether you want it or not, and making sure that you kind of look around and gather up as much insurance as you can afford and build it into your business plan. Start now. So anyway, it's just very important. Crop insurance is important, but also just this general insurance is important. Next slide. I think I've already hit on some of these issues, so let's go to the next slide. Again, I've hit on some of these issues. If you get sued for a food safety liability issue, please go hire a lawyer. It'll be worth your money. You've got to think about how to extricate yourself from this problem. Next slide. So now we're going, this next group of slides is really talking about market issues. And I'm going to keep going. Some of these we've already covered. But I want to share with you some issues before we kind of open it up. Next slide. I think we've also covered this as well. Why do we care about market liability? Obviously, you've got compliance cost issues, You can have an adverse impact on your business plan if you start to get exposed to liability when engaging in the market. You've really got to weigh and minimize your risk. You know, your profit margins can be affected by not handling your market liability properly. And anyone who's actually thinking about entering a new market, like having a new product, like having a value-added product from their strawberry, you really have to think clearly not just about how you're going to constitute that product and make that product, but you've also got to think about what is the nutrient levels of those products. How can you actually put that product on a shelf with a label? Because it, in most circumstances, is going to require a label that meets federal requirements. So, you know, and in moving into these value-added products, for example, and in moving into new markets, you really got to stop long enough to actually walk around and analyze all of your risks, your legal risks, your food safety risks, any financial risks that you might have, and then just how do you handle being in this new marketplace? How do you handling this new product? There's just layers of market risk that really have to be examined as you go from a raw product into a value-added, for sure. But even when you take on a new raw product, like you've been doing green beans forever, and now you're going to do squash. Well, where's your market? Where are you going with that food? If you're going to sell it, what are the selling requirements of the potential folks you're going to sell it to? Is it just in a farmer's market, or is it in a grocery store? Is it in a school? I mean, all of these potential market outlets may have very specific requirements that kind of control whether or not you can access that market to sell your product. And so doing your homework to really uncover what these new risks might be is very much worth the time you invest in doing so. Next slide. Managing the liability for your food product, obviously prevention, we talked about a lot today. Food safety planning for having the highest levels of food safety. How do you verify that to your buyers, and how do you verify it if you are the food company that's taking raw food product from a bunch of different farms, and how do you make sure that your suppliers are doing everything they can to prevent foodborne illness problems? Preparation for the worst case scenario, I've already talked about that today. Look at your contracts, figure out what your relationships are. Do you have insurance? Are you required to indemnify anybody? What happens in a worst case scenario and you're implied in the foodborne illness outbreak? How do you actually track down your product? Where is it going? And because the responsibility will be on you to go get it and have it delivered back to you, or go pick it up and pull it out of the supply chain. So the other thing I want you to think about too is, you know, a worst case scenario, nobody likes to think about it. Nobody really even likes to prepare or plan for it. We just hope it never happens. But, you know, let's say you've spent 20 years getting your unique food product up and running, and it's out there and it's awesome and everybody loves it, and all of a sudden you are implied in a foodborne illness outbreak. Think for a moment, even if you have impeccable records and you've got all your GAP certifications and you can prove yourself out of a lawsuit, think for a moment the impact of being implied in that foodborne illness outbreak is going to have on the reputation of you personally and the reputation of your brand, the thing that you have spent 20 years of your life having this whole following of people who love your food. I mean, think about the impact on your reputation. And it's real. I mean, if you think about some of the real high-profile foodborne illness outbreaks with big recalls and all of that, I mean, Chipotle is a great example of a recent one. I mean, they've had to repair and repair and repair their reputation. They even had to shut stores down while they were trying to get to the root of their foodborne illness problem. And then they had a period of time where they literally had to give away food products in order to actually get their consumers back in their store. So understanding the impact of this whole food safety liability and awareness is so important, because some of these things you can't repair. If your reputation is so deeply damaged, you may be out of business altogether, and which could set up a whole cascade of problems, with your whoever you borrowed money from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've just got to really kind of think through those things and do your level best to try to avoid any damaging of your reputation, your tribe's reputation, or your tribe's food product reputation. Next slide. You've got to know your product, particularly if you're accepting raw products from other places. You've got to know where they're grown and how they're grown, who grows them, and how they're handled and stored. It may seem nosy, but the reality is that you're all in it together. You're taking their component parts and you're making something else out of them. So you really have to, because of the food safety liability law and the state of the law in the U.S., you really got to know what the players that are working with you have in motion. Not just you, but you really need to be vigilant. A lot of farmers markets that I've worked with that are large and stable literally send their farmers market managers out to do spot inspections of farms that are on the market. That's not to be nosy, but it is to make sure that everybody's doing what they say they're going to do, and everybody's records are in good shape, and they've got their insurance policies. A lot of farmers markets require those now and have for some time. But this whole arena of the changing landscape of food safety plans, those are going to be looked at in the future as well. Next slide. Then, why do we care about marketing and labeling? A lot of people go, oh gosh, haven't you talked enough to me about all this other stuff? And now we're getting down into the label. Bottom line here, and this really goes back to this other slide previously about warranties, you're not really free to say whatever you want to about your food. There are certain requirements that attach to what can be on a label if food is in the food supply chain, if it's a meat, and if it's not a meat. I mean, it's meat as in protein. There are certain things that you should not use that terminology if it's not what it is. You cannot just call something organic if it's not. You can't call it all natural if it's not. Those words actually mean something in the marketplace, and there are federal agencies that control how terminology is approved for use in a labeling. And then there's just the general, don't lie about your product. That should be common sense, but it also rolls back into those warranty issues that we discussed previously. Next slide. Who regulates food marketing? That's a whole list. That's not all of them, but right at the top of it are FDA and USDA, and because it matters. I mean, over time, these laws have been put into place because people were lying about the food. They were saying that it was what it was not. And so when that becomes too prevalent, then you get into a circumstance where there are going to be laws passed about it. And so you've got to really think through how you label your product, what you say about it, whether it's true, whether you can prove it. And then the other situation is back with warranties. People can sue you for your product not living up to what you say it was. That's called fraud. Next slide. Marketing claims can be literally on package labels. They can be on like handouts, sell sheets that you have sitting out or handing off to your consumers. It can be on your website. It can be on your social media. It can be documents and stuff that you use at trade shows. It can be marketing materials, paid advertising. All of those are places where you're saying something, either in writing or verbally, about your food product. So the words themselves are important. They have to be substantiated, and in some cases they are controlled by laws that prohibit you to make certain representations if they're not true. Next slide. Non-GMO, that's a big, everybody's putting non-GMO on their products, even if the products are not GMO focused. So that's kind of interesting to walk through grocery stores right now and actually see what all carries that signage, when in actuality the products within it may not even come from GMO crops. But that's a whole other webinar. The states are moving into these areas. Vermont is a prime example of GMO labeling. Federal legislation, Congress still can't decide what to do about this. It keeps coming up. A lot of the food marketplace, like Whole Foods, some of these large grocery chains are already moving into the space of requiring labels if you want to be in their stores. So organic certification has been around for a while. There's an elaborate protocol for actually being able to carry the USDA organic certified label. Whole subject for a whole nother webinar and a whole nother protocol on how to actually achieve that certification standard, but you cannot carry that language on your label if you have not met those standards. And so that kind of labeling is very specific. Kosher and vegan, I mean, those are another example. Some of those are third-party verifier, voluntary labeling certifications, and some are controlled by federal law or state law. Next slide. State laws, every state that I know of has consumer protection laws that really kind of roll into deceptive practices or marketing practices and unfair and deceptive language. So you've got to be very kind of careful about your language with regard to your market, reaching out into your market with your food product, because you don't want to inadvertently cross over a line that might be in place through a state law. And again, those can differ from state to state in terms of how stringent that particular state is on what you can actually put on a label. Next slide. This is just an additional explanatory for just a slide for general consumer laws, but they do apply to food, and so you've got to be very careful about, again, what you're saying, and is it unfair? Would a reasonable consumer interpret what you're saying in an unreasonable way? I mean, you've got to really figure out exactly what the laws are, where you are, and do your best to try to come into compliance with those laws and how you talk about your food product. Next slide. And again, on most of those laws, actually being deceived is not required. It's almost like strict liability. You don't have to be hoodwinked. It's what you did to lead me down a hoodwinked path. So, in the early days of my legal career, state attorneys general, didn't look at this stuff. But since the 80s and on into today, state attorneys general and then consumer groups within states have been very focused on food marketing, trying to get at health claims and through food labeling. So there's been quite a bit of attention paid to how labels, what labels say and whether they can be substantiated. Are they deceptive, or are they engaging in some kind of unfair trade practice through the label? And so this is an area that's getting heightened scrutiny over time. And so it's just one of those things that you've got to think about how you actually arrive at what you say about your food product on its label and how you market it, because it is controlled now in a variety of ways that 30, 40, 50 years ago was not. Next slide. This is a great little slide. Of course, I could come up with 1,000 different others, but these are all examples of cases that have been brought against companies by state attorneys general over language on a label and whether or not that language was deceptive, or whether it can be proven. And so just take a look at those briefly. So, I mean, I'm not making this up. These things happen all the time. And just because those are fairly large companies that are being pursued, that doesn't mean that you as a small company are relieved from having to comply with all of this. You're just as touched by the use of terminology as these big companies are. They're just a bigger target. Next slide. So you got to do your naming homework. You've got to structure your label in accordance with FDA and USDA guidelines. Again, USDA is on the meat side, but a lot of these labels, particularly around nutrient claims, have been changing over time and have been the subject of quite a bit of attention in terms of what is the nutrient content of your product, which is, you know, a required label, but also you really need to be thinking about how you talk about the product and what claims you make, and whether they can be substantiated. Next slide. And then my last couple of slides are on allergens. You know, there's so many people who are allergic to food products and to, you know, ingredients that are in foods. If you look at the food allergen arena, there's 8 big areas, and I've listed them there for you. Milk, eggs, fish, crustaceans, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soya, soybean. And so those allergens are literally a part of a federal law that requires that those allergens be labeled. Why? Because people can die when they eat them. And so if your food company or food product involves any of these, then you have got to comply with the marketing and labeling requirements to a T. Because literally it's not just somebody might turn their nose up at your food because they don't like that it has milk in it. They literally could choke to death and die because they're so highly allergic to it. So it's just know that if your ingredients or if your product that you're putting on the marketplaces or selling amongst yourselves has any of these items in them as ingredients, you've got to take special care of the consumer. That really is your responsibility and not theirs, because they don't know what's in your food, particularly if it's a value-added food product. So there's also some very specific requirements about if you've got multiple different ingredients that are all getting, you know, thrown into the menu within your food company, and they're all getting amalgamated into one food product. There's separation requirements. There's also, you know, sanitation requirements. And I'll tell you, if you sign up for that FDA, you know, daily alert, you'll be surprised how many food recalls are focused around these big 8 and around allergens that inadvertently get into a particular food as a part of the manufacturing process of that food, and just or they just sat as raw products next to or were mixed with one of these allergen products. So it's one of those areas that people can die and die quickly, and so it's just a heightened area that requires your attention. Next slide. And I promise we're almost to the end. Again, I've already gone through some of this, and I've given you a couple of links to some acts that are specific with regard to some of the allergen issues. Next slide. And these control plans, when you're actually in a food business or even handling different kinds of raw foods, you've got to think about segregation and how you control for the ingredients and labels. You've got to prevent cross-contact between food items during your processing. There's some staff training and education that's required by the law and regulation around allergens. So just be aware that, just keep in mind those 8, and then think about what is in your ingredients, what is your raw products that you're dealing with, and if you're in any of those 8, then you have a heightened level of control and knowledge that is required of you. Next slide. And then again, finally, this is a part of a risk management series. We've touched on a lot of things today: marketing risk, market risk, labels, food safety risk, which is considered a legal risk, but those are the big 5 areas: financial, marketing, legal, human resources, and production risk. Again, I'm going to reiterate, please consider crop insurance. If you are addressing any production risk, you really need to have it, particularly if you're trying to build a solid, sustainable, food business that has that your consumers depend on you to have, there and readily available. So the other piece of this puzzle is liability insurance that can address some of your legal risks, your marketing risk, your food safety, and your human resource risk as well. So just another cautionary note that those are there to help you, and not terribly expensive to build into your business plan, but in the grand scheme of things, they do serve you well. I think that's our last slide, and we can open up the line, but Emerald, can you go to the next slide, because I think it's our contact information. Yep, there it is. So anytime you got a question, give us a holler. You can visit our website, call, and just send an email to me. If I don't know the answer, then somebody on our team will. And if we don't know it, we'll look it up. So let's open the line and see who's got some questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Janie. I just wanted to let everyone know that they have been unmuted, and we are at the question and answer portion of the webinar. Does anyone have any questions?
I do.
All right, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Buck, Janie. Also, what you talked about in your documentation is that, sometimes you talked about value added, and we've had a case here where, they was involved in a recall because of the documentation that the manufacturer didn't follow, so they got involved in a recall. So that's, real important too.
Does anyone else have any questions? All right, we'll go ahead and conclude our webinar for today. I just want to remind everyone that the slides and a complete listing of our other webinars are available in the handout portion of your control screen. And please remember to fill out the evaluation when you close the webinar for today. Have a good day.
Oh, no.